In the financial world, when the same institution files a third warning report within one cycle, well, it signals something deeper than a headline. That's where we are right now. Representative Sherry Tanador of Michigan has introduced a new set of articles of impeachment against former President Donald Trump. And unlike the past cases, this one targets the foundation of executive restraint. You see, from an investor's perspective, this is less about politics and more about signals about how far leadership can push before triggering systemic distrust. Structural instability doesn't always start with chaos. Sometimes, well, it begins with quiet patterns we ignore for too long. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, because this matters to every single American, whether you follow politics closely or not. Tanador argues that Trump has repeatedly acted in ways that undermine the Constitution and governance. She points to unauthorized deportations, harmful tariff strategies, and the weakening of key federal agencies. Now, in capital markets, when leadership distorts the rules that ensure fair oversight, investors adjust expectations, you see, not just for profits, but for long-term national risk. Power unchecked is not efficient, it's expensive. And what we're witnessing now is the growing cost of institutional fragility that, well, markets cannot hedge. Now listen, with Democrats holding a minority in the House, the odds of immediate success are slim. But impeachment isn't always about removal, you see. Sometimes it's about record. A third official attempt marks a constitutional anomaly. If it proceeds, it will reshape how future leaders calculate risk. If it fails, well, it may normalize a dangerous precedent. And either way, the long-term effects on trust, law, and civic capital are what we should measure. Because in any system, credibility compounds just like interest. And once it erodes, it rarely returns at the same value. What's happened over the past 48 hours is particularly telling, you see. The conversation in Washington has shifted from speculation to structural crisis. New impeachment articles were filed on October 11th and 12th, marking a turning point not just in politics, but in governance. From a risk management view, well, the concern lies in the convergence of parallel threats. Formal charges from Congress on one side and quiet talk of internal intervention from Trump's own cabinet on the other. That dual pressure signals institutional fracture. In corporate terms, it's like a board considering both a shareholder lawsuit and a CEO ouster in the same breath, you see. You don't see that unless the core system is under real stress. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Sources close to the administration now report that high-ranking officials have quietly discussed invoking the 25th Amendment. That clause, well, allows the transfer of presidential power if the sitting leader is deemed unable to fulfill their duties. These are not mid-level aides or partisan actors. We're talking about cabinet-level deliberations, you see. As someone who has observed leadership transitions in boardrooms for over half a century, I can tell you this. When insiders begin contingency planning for forced succession, the issue is no longer about disagreement. It's about institutional continuity. And that conversation only happens when waiting brings greater risk than acting. What's unfolding is historically unique, you see. We're witnessing impeachment proceedings from Congress overlapping with executive branch discussions about forcibly replacing a sitting president. That's not noise. That's a constitutional stress test. It shows that confidence isn't just eroding among political opponents, it's breaking down within the chain of command. You see, in markets, when stakeholders at every level start hedging against the same actor, well, it's not volatility, it's the insolvency of leadership. That distinction matters because it shifts the question from whether removal is likely to whether institutional survival now depends on it. This moment is without precedent, not because political divisions are new, but because internal confidence appears to be unraveling. For key members of a sitting administration to signal disapproval, quietly or publicly, well, represents more than dissent. It's a sign that core operational trust has broken down. When seasoned leaders lose faith in the very system they help build, that's not drama, you see. That's structural concern. You can't run a country or a company when internal alignment disappears. The breakdown always begins behind closed doors. And what we're seeing now are the first public glimpses of what's been happening in private for some time. Amid all the noise, one thing becomes clear to me. It's increasingly difficult to rely on surface-level reporting. You see, in business, we don't act on headlines. We look at fundamentals, incentives, and behaviors. The same applies here. What matters is not just what people are saying, but who is saying it, why they're saying it now, and how it aligns with patterns. As we've seen before, we are witnessing signals, not speculate, and smart decision makers will learn to separate the two. So let's return to the substance here, because this is important, you see. These impeachment articles don't recycle old narratives. They aren't about Ukraine. They don't revisit January 6th. This isn't repetition. These are new claims rooted in recent executive actions that raise fresh constitutional alarms. That distinction is critical because when new precedent is being set, the timeline matters, you see. And markets, political or financial, respond most sharply not to chaos, but to uncertainty about what the rules truly are. That's where we are now. In the past few days, we've seen a dramatic shift, not only in tone, but in the severity of the charges being raised, you see. Some lawmakers are now describing the president's recent actions as a form of hostile engagement against the very country he served. These are not metaphorical accusations, you understand. The phrase being used is treasonous warfare. From a legal standpoint, such language is rare. From an investor's perspective, well, it signals that confidence in executive restraint has reached a breaking point. When leaders are accused of acting against their own nation, we are no longer discussing politics, you see. We are measuring the integrity of the republic itself. Alongside that is a second charge, ongoing and systematic violations of constitutional right. This isn't about a singular misstep. It's described as a repeated pattern of power exercise beyond its legal limits. That kind of pattern, if confirmed, well, creates a ripple effect far beyond headlines, you see. In any institution, be it a corporation or a government, when rules are bent consistently without consequence, trust decays, and when trust goes, so does stability. Now, legal scholars and constitutional experts have flagged two specific incidents that escalated these concerns and triggered the new articles of impeachment. Let me walk you through them, because they are important to understand, you see. The first occurred on October 9th, when the president issued an executive order declaring Antifa a terrorist organization. Regardless of one's view on that group, the constitutional process for making such a designation is well defined. It requires legal thresholds, interagency review, and congressional oversight, you see. None of that was followed here. The concern is not just about who was targeted, but about how it was done. Unilateral power used outside the bounds of the law, well, sets a precedent, and in both markets and governance, bad precedent becomes a cost nobody sees until it's too late, you see. There's a well-established legal framework for identifying terrorist organizations. It requires congressional input, multi-agency coordination, and adherence to statutory thresholds. But in this case, the president bypassed that entire process and issued an executive order unilaterally. That alone raised eyebrows. However, what followed was even more concerning, you see. Reports surfaced that a federal prosecutor may have been dismissed for declining to launch politically motivated investigations into the president's opponents. In any system, political or financial, when enforcement tools are redirected for personal use, well, we stop measuring leadership and start questioning legitimacy. To be clear, this isn't about miscommunication or policy disagreement. You see, if the allegation holds, it means a public official lost their position for refusing to prosecute political rivals without sufficient ground. Legal scholars are already calling this a serious breach of constitutional norms. It's not just about one job, you see. It's about precedent. If the Justice Department becomes subject to personal directives rather than legal standards, the rule of law takes a backseat. And once accountability is compromised, rebuilding trust becomes exponentially harder. According to multiple sources, the federal prosecutor in question, Eric Burt, has reportedly been pressured to resign. The message is clear: comply or be removed, you see. That tactic may sound like executive authority in motion, but it also resembles coercion more than governance. When leadership starts targeting its own appointees for not executing political agendas, it reflects not strength but instability, you see. In any boardroom, forcing out voices of legal integrity would trigger audits, resignations and shareholder revolt. In government, well, the stakes are even higher because the shareholders are the people. An emergency staff meeting was reportedly scheduled after news broke that a top federal prosecutor might be dismissed, you see. The reason? Refusing to pursue criminal charges against New York Attorney General Letitia James. That in itself is alarming, but what's more telling is what happened behind the scenes. As impeachment articles moved forward in Congress, senior officials within the executive branch began holding private talks, not about damage control, but about invoking the 25th Amendment. You see, that indicates something deeper than disagreement. It suggests a total breakdown of internal confidence. Let me clarify what this amendment really means because it's important, you see. The 25th Amendment is a constitutional mechanism that allows the Vice President and a majority of cabinet members to formally declare that the president is no longer able to discharge the duties of the office. It was created not for politics, but for continuity, moments when national leadership must remain intact despite crisis. You see, after January 6th, this idea wasn't abstract. Staff, family members, and high-level advisors discussed ways to preserve institutional stability before the transfer of power. That tells you how close the system came to collapse. Multiple cabinet members at the time reportedly considered invoking that clause, you see. Several chose to resign instead. One senior figure went further, suggesting that the remaining cabinet step in and collectively manage the administration to minimize chaos. In corporate terms, that's equivalent to a board moving to constrain a CEO in real time. It rarely happens unless the risk of inaction is judged to be greater than the fallout of intervention use. In this case, it wasn't just about reputational risk, it was about preventing systemic failure at the highest level of government. Now, the push to hold former President Trump accountable hasn't just emerged overnight, you see. It's been years in the making. Civil society groups, legal coalitions, lawmakers, they've steadily compiled documentation, legal analysis, and case material aimed at addressing what they see as constitutional violations. But timing, in matters of statecraft like in investment, well, is everything. Democratic leaders have exercised restraint not out of fear, but out of caution. You see, a poorly timed impeachment isn't just ineffective, it reshapes the narrative, often empowering the very figure it seeks to limit. History casts a long shadow here. Trump was impeached twice, you see. And each time he survived the process with his political capital intact, perhaps even enhanced. The Senate's refusal to convict in both cases reinforced the perception among his base that he was the target of political theater, not legal scrutiny. That perception, once embedded, well, becomes a powerful asset. In branding and politics alike, perceived victimhood can translate into momentum. That's the tightrope Democrats are walking, risking legitimizing the very behavior they aim to challenge. That's why leadership has been waiting for a trigger so unmistakable, so institutionally disruptive, that even members across the aisle would be forced to reconsider their position, you see. The recent executive order labeling Antifa a terrorist group may represent that turning point. For some, the move feels like overdue action. But for others, well, it signals a departure from due process and an erosion of legal precedent. This isn't just about public perception, you see. It's about whether executive action is drifting too far from the system of legal constraints designed to protect the balance of power. In a constitutional democracy, power doesn't exist in isolation. There are guardrails for a reason, you see. The designation of a terrorist organization, for example, follows a structured process led by the State Department, supported by intelligence and subject to congressional oversight. It's not designed for discretionary use. When a president bypasses that framework and acts unilaterally, the issue isn't just legal, it's systemic. Leadership becomes unpredictable, you see, and in both markets and government, unpredictability is the enemy of trust. These legal protocols are not red tape, you understand. They exist to prevent abuse. Declaring a person or group a terrorist doesn't just carry a headline, it activates mechanisms that can freeze bank accounts, authorize surveillance without the usual checks, and initiate arrests under special provisions. These are tools meant for national defense, not political advantage, you see. But when those tools are deployed without meeting the legal threshold, constitutional scholars aren't just concerned, they're alarmed. Because if the system allows it once, well, it may not resist it the next time. Now we shift to the parallel case involving a federal prosecutor. And this is where things get even more troubling, you see. According to several independent sources, that prosecutor was allegedly instructed to open investigations against individuals who were also political adversaries of the president. This isn't just a story about personnel, it's about institutional neutrality. Prosecutors represent the legal system, not the ambitions of any one leader, you see. If that line is crossed, you don't just erode trust in justice, you risk turning law into leverage. And that transformation, once set in motion, well, is very hard to reverse. That shift is not a small matter. According to multiple independent reports, some federal prosecutors may have faced dismissal not for misconduct, but for failing to pursue charges that lacked legal foundation, you see. In the corporate world, removing compliance officers for refusing to bend the rules would trigger immediate investigations. In government, the implications are even greater. It raises concerns that prosecutorial independence, a cornerstone of justice, is being treated as a transactional tool rather than a protected function of law, you see. If the allegations prove accurate, and I stress the word if, then we're no longer in the realm of politics. We're looking at a serious breach of ethical governance. Using prosecutorial authority to target political adversaries is not just wrong, you see. It breaks the chain of trust between citizen and state. In authoritarian regimes, the justice system serves the executive, but in a constitutional democracy, it must serve the law. Any deviation from that principle invites long-term damage that cannot be undone by the next election cycle. In parallel with these concerns, another federal action made headlines, you see. A judge issued a temporary block against an effort to lay off thousands of government workers during the shutdown. The court described the move as politically charged and reckless, citing the human toll of eliminating over 4,000 jobs without due consideration. In investment terms, this isn't just a labor issue. It's about governance risk, you see. When short-term tactics override long-term stability, value erodes, whether in business or in public service. Decisions that ignore real human costs, well, tend to compound into broader systemic failure. Federal employee unions have raised an important concern that the targeted layoffs during the shutdown were politically calculated to exert pressure on Congress rather than respond to operational necessity, you see. With the impasse entering its third week, the broader impact is already visible. One organization, Free Speech for People, has been tracking executive conduct since the start of Trump's second term. Their current report lists 25 separate justifications for impeachment, you see. That number is not just symbolic. It reflects a growing pattern, a series of unchecked decisions that collectively threaten the rule-based foundation of governance. Some allegations on that list will sound familiar, you see. Mishandling of classified material, financial entanglements, and ethical breaches have all been discussed before. What's changed is the addition of two new items in the past 48 hours. One stems from the unilateral Antifa designation, the other from the attempt to fire a federal prosecutor over political noncompliance, you see. What sets this impeachment push apart from previous efforts isn't just the content, it's the coalition. And the momentum is no longer confined to partisan lines. It's being echoed by voices across the legal and academic spectrum. It's no longer just progressive circles driving this, you see. Prominent legal organizations, former federal prosecutors, and even some conservative constitutional scholars are raising alarm. Their concern isn't about optics, it's about precedent. When bipartisan experts converge on the idea that a red line has been crossed, the conversation shifts, you see. And that brings us back to the 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967. This provision was designed to solve a very specific problem. What happens when a president becomes incapable, physically, mentally, or otherwise, of fulfilling the duties of office? It was built not for crisis theater, but for operational continuity. Before the 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967, the United States had no formal process for dealing with a president who became physically or mentally incapacitated. You see, that absence left the country exposed to leadership vacuums. Section 4 of the amendment addressed that gap. It allows the vice president, with support from a majority of the cabinet, to declare the president unfit to discharge the powers and duties of the office. Think of it as an emergency succession clause, a mechanism built not for politics, but for continuity in moments of institutional vulnerability, you see. In that scenario, the vice president immediately assumes the role of acting president. But here's what makes this clause unprecedented in practice. It has never been used against a president who refused to step aside, you see. There have been instances of voluntary power transfers, like when President Reagan underwent surgery, but never a forced transition. The legal framework exists. The constitutional door is open, yet no one has ever crossed the threshold under opposition. You see, if it happens, it won't just be a first, it will become a reference point for every presidency to follow. According to credible reports, high-level members of the administration are quietly weighing the possibility, you see. These aren't fringe voices. They include individuals tasked with protecting the integrity of the executive branch. When cabinet-level leaders begin mapping out a constitutional exit strategy for a sitting president, it signals more than personal discontent. It reflects structural fear, you see. In corporate governance, when board members explore forced succession for a CEO mid-crisis, well, the company has already lost more than just confidence. It has lost internal cohesion. And the same logic applies here. That conversation, the idea of invoking the 25th Amendment, isn't theoretical anymore, you see. It reflects a real calculation about institutional stability during the final stretch of a presidency under pressure. Over the last 48 hours, the intensity of concern inside the executive branch has clearly accelerated. But acting on that concern carries a cost for those considering it. The political risk is massive, you see. In today's hyper-polarized environment, even legitimate action may be branded as betrayal. Once that label sticks, it turns public servants into pariahs, cut off from influence, isolated from future coalitions. So the mere fact that senior officials are weighing this option tells us something, you see. They believe standard checks no longer suffice. The names aren't public yet, but based on reporting, the group appears to include legal counsel and national security personnel, people responsible for constitutional continuity and threat containment, you see. If those roles now feel the system is slipping outside the bounds of self-correction, then what we're seeing isn't just alarm, it's a signal that core mechanisms of restraint are perceived as ineffective. That's the kind of breakdown that precedes institutional intervention. This urgency is no coincidence, you see. October 2025 marks a narrowing window. Midterm elections are less than a year away, and political momentum tends to harden as voting season nears. Democrats understand that once the calendar flips, the cost of delay may become irreversible, you see. If Republicans gain seats in the next cycle, well, the chance to pursue impeachment could vanish altogether. It's a classic timing dilemma. Act under pressure now or lose the ability to act later. In markets, we call that a missed opportunity cost. In government, it's often the beginning of paralysis. Momentum is rarely driven by one event, you see. It builds over time through repeated signals. In this case, the Antifa order and the prosecutor firing are not isolated anomalies. They're part of a sequence. Inside the government, decision makers are increasingly seeing these moves as part of a pattern, one that may reflect a broader disregard for procedural limits. You see, when institutions detect recurring stress points without corrective action, confidence begins to shift from caution to alarm. Political theorists will dissect this moment for years. The more urgent issue is institutional response before the pattern hardens into precedent. What we're watching is a collision between constitutional principle and political execution, you see. And like any system under pressure, outcomes become more unpredictable the longer they're delayed. If the House were to proceed with impeachment, the first step would be a formal vote. With Democrats currently holding the majority, that path is procedurally possible, you see. But in matters of governance, the vote isn't just about numbers. It's about timing, perception, and consequence. Every institutional move now sends a signal not only to voters, but to future administrations about what is tolerated and what is challenged. Here's where the road narrows, you see. A successful impeachment in the House doesn't end the process. It shifts the burden to the Senate, and conviction there requires a 2/3 majority. That threshold isn't just mathematical, it's cultural, you see. It demands bipartisan agreement on constitutional limits, Importantly, neither impeachment nor the 25th Amendment automatically disqualifies the president from seeking office again. Only if the Senate convicts and then holds a follow-up vote by simple majority can that ban be enacted, you see. In corporate terms, this is the equivalent of a board not only removing a CEO, but also barring future reinstatement. The stakes are legacy, not just legality. At that stage, if the Senate delivers a conviction, only 51 votes would be needed to bar the former president from holding federal office again, you see. But this process extends beyond eligibility. It's about historical positioning. Every impeachment establishes a documented benchmark, a permanent record that shapes how future generations interpret leadership. In capital markets, reputational damage can linger far longer than operational losses, you see. In politics, the same principle applies. A legacy marked by repeated impeachment becomes a liability not just for the individual, but for the institutions that enabled it. If this proceeds, Trump would become the first president in United States history to face 3 separate impeachments, you see. That fact alone carries symbolic weight. But there's also a media dynamic to consider. Weeks, perhaps months of public hearings would force lawmakers to confront these allegations in full view. For Republicans, it would mean placing their alignment with Trump under public scrutiny, you see. For the public, it could become a tipping point. Opinion isn't just shaped by facts, it's shaped by the way those facts are processed over time. Visibility alters perception, and perception, well, influences election. Even without removal, the downstream impact could be substantial, you see. It might weaken the administration's ability to negotiate, govern, or influence policy. It would also reframe how historians, legal scholars, and future leaders interpret this era. As for the 25th Amendment, that remains an entirely different lever, you see. Unlike impeachment, which unfolds through weeks of procedural steps, the 25th can transfer power almost immediately. It's designed for moments of urgency. And when institutions face mounting uncertainty, the speed of resolution becomes a critical factor, not just for governance, but for stability itself. If the 25th Amendment were invoked, the vice president would immediately assume the role of acting president, you see. Legally, the process transfers authority first, then asks questions later. Even if Trump contested the decision, he'd remain out of office while the dispute moved through Congress. Regaining power would require approval from both chambers, the House and the Senate, you see. And unlike impeachment, which begins in the House, this reversal demands majorities on both ends. It's the governance equivalent of a hostile takeover, except the shareholders are the institutions themselves. Theoretically, the 25th offers a faster, more surgical resolution than impeachment, you see. But it comes with a caveat. The vice president must initiate or agree to the move. Without that buy-in, the entire mechanism collapses. This makes it not only a legal question, but a leadership one, you see. If the second highest officer in the nation won't act, then the cabinet has no viable path forward. That dependency is intentional. It was designed to protect against reactionary overreach. It also means that even when consensus exists, action still demands centralized courage. Here's the deeper risk, and this is important to understand, you see. If the 25th is ever used not for genuine incapacity, but as a political instrument, it sets a precedent no system can easily undo. Imagine a future where policy disagreements evolve into removal campaign, you see. That's not institutional balance. That's executive instability disguised as oversight. The line between necessary intervention and political ambition must remain razor sharp. Once blurred, it undermines not just this presidency, but the structural trust every presidency relies on, you see. In finance, that's called reputational contagion. In democracy, well, it's how legitimacy unravels. If one administration crosses the line and uses constitutional mechanisms as tactical leverage, it invites the next to do the same, you see. What was once a last resort safeguard becomes a weaponized option. That's not constitutional order, it's strategic erosion. Every president would then lead under the shadow of internal ouster, not just public approval. It shifts the balance of power inward and creates chronic instability, you see. From where I sit, it's not just dangerous, it's expensive, because uncertainty always carries increase cost. And if this proceeds, the next steps will be loud, public, and consequential, you see. The House is likely to move forward. And the media storm will be substantial. If impeachment articles do pass in the House, Trump would become the only president in American history to be impeached 3 times. That alone carries symbolic weight, you see. But the Senate remains the real test. There, the effort will likely stall. Republicans will frame it as partisan overreach and attempt to reverse the electoral process. Democrats, in contrast, will argue it's about accountability and the preservation of norms. But as with most polarizing events in modern politics, the narrative will fracture, you see. Each side will speak to its base, and the broader public will be left to interpret the noise. The nation, already divided, will likely remain split. Public opinion won't shift overnight, especially not in this environment, you see. As for the 25th Amendment, it will probably fade from conversation. The political cost is too steep and the legal foundation too untested. Cabinet members will weigh the risk to their reputations and careers, and most will conclude it's not worth acting, see. In capital markets, we call this reputational risk aversion. In politics, it becomes a kind of strategic paralysis, where everyone sees the cliff ahead, but no one wants to take the first step away from it. The very fact that this conversation is happening inside halls of power, media cycles, and living rooms tells us something critical, you see. It's not just noise. It's a signal. It means decision makers, some of them inside the administration itself, believe the situation is no longer sustainable. From my experience in both business and civic life, when insiders begin raising red flags, it rarely stems from ideology. Structural comes from discomfort with risk, and in this case, the risk isn't financial, it's institutional. That should concern every American, whether you follow politics daily or try to tune it out, you see. Because structural failure doesn't start with collapse, it starts with silence that turns into normalization. At its core, this is a test of our constitutional architecture, you see. Can institutional guardrails function when they're under real stress? Not in theory, but in practice. Is the legislative branch still a meaningful counterweight, or has partisanship hollowed out its courage? Do cabinet members act as fiduciaries of the republic or just loyalists to one person, you see? I've always said that character is revealed under pressure. The same is true of institutions. We're about to find out whether checks and balances are more than words printed in textbooks. This is not just a political trial, it's a stress test of the American promise. What happens next will echo far beyond one presidency, you see. If accountability fails now, we set a precedent that future leaders, regardless of party, study closely and not for the right reasons. If power faces no cost when abused, the incentive structure of our democracy warps, you see. You don't need to be a historian to see how that plays out over time. But if this moment yields real, proportionate consequences, we might just restore the idea that no individual, not even the president, is above the system. And in the long run, that's the kind of signal markets, citizens, and democracies respond to with renewed faith. When institutions start exercising their constitutional muscles, it sends a ripple through the system, you see. Not just to lawmakers, but to markets, to businesses, and to everyday Americans watching from their homes. If impeachment becomes just another procedural formality detached from principle, then it loses the deterrent power that's supposed to protect our republic, you see. Accountability isn't just about today's headlines. It's about preserving the long-term health of a system built on trust. If leaders, whether cabinet members or voters, retreat into silence, well, the consequences won't just be political, they'll be cultural. And as any investor will tell you, culture eats strategy for breakfast. The landscape is still moving, you see. You might see more voices inside the administration deciding to step forward, either out of conviction or self-preservation. Documents may surface, timelines may shift. Even party loyalty has limits when reputational risk becomes steep, you see. And sometimes the cost of staying quiet outweighs the cost of dissent. But let's not be naive. There's also a real chance that the machinery stalls, and in doing so, rewards defiance. That's the paradox of political inertia, you see. Sometimes it strengthens what it fails to stop. What matters is not just who wins the moment, but whether the country learns anything from it. Whatever unfolds next, it's going to be a case study for generations, you see, about leadership, about institutional courage, and about how democracies respond to internal stress. These aren't just volatile weeks, they're turning points. And history has a way of assigning weight to the decisions made in such moments, you see. We're not spectators in this story, we're all stakeholders. Whether we're managing capital, managing a business, or simply raising families, the integrity of our democratic infrastructure determines the climate in which we all operate. It's why it matters. That's why I'm watching closely. The immediate path forward hinges on a fragile calculus of political courage and constitutional duty, you see. While the House may possess the procedural votes to advance the articles, the true battleground lies in the court of public opinion and the silent corridors of power, where allegiances are tested. The allegations are no longer about a single event, but a consolidated pattern of behavior that challenges the very mechanisms of accountability. You see, this is not merely a political crisis, it is a diagnostic moment for the republic's immune system. The question is whether the antibodies of democracy, oversight, legal consequence, and institutional pushback are robust enough to counter a sustained challenge to their authority, you see. Parallel discussions of impeachment and the 25th Amendment reveal a system exploring every available tool in its arsenal. This multi-pronged response indicates the severity of the perceived threat. It is a sign of a living constitution, you see, but also, a sign of profound distress. The markets have long understood that uncertainty is the enemy of investment, you see. Similarly, in governance, ambiguity about the rules of engagement erodes the foundational trust required for a stable state. The coming days will be a masterclass in real-time political risk assessment. Watch not only for the public statements and votes, but for the resignations, the anonymous leaks from within the administration, and the subtle shifts in language from key institutional players, you see. These are the leading indicators of systemic change. The weight of history now rests on the shoulders of a relatively small group of individuals, you see. Lawmakers, cabinet secretaries, and senior advisors who must decide whether their primary loyalty is to an individual or to the office and the constitutional order it represents. Their choices, made under immense pressure and public scrutiny, will become part of the permanent record, setting a template for how future crises of legitimacy are managed. You see, the cost of action is high, the cost of inaction, the normalization of these actions, and the precedent it would set may be incalculably higher, potentially altering the character of the American presidency for generations to come. This is not about one man, you see. It's about the system that outlives him. It's about whether we as a nation still believe in the guardrails our founders built, or whether we've decided they're optional when politically inconvenient. In investing, I've always said the most important quality is temperament, not intellect, you see. The same is true for democracy. Do we have the temperament to enforce accountability when it's hard, when it's unpopular, when it divides us? That's the test, and we're all being graded. Listen, I've lived through a lot of political turmoil in my 94 years, you see. I've seen crises that felt like the end of everything, and I've watched the system bend, crack, but ultimately hold. This moment feels different, not because the threats are new, but because the response mechanisms are being tested in ways they've never been tested before, you see. What we do now, what our leaders do now, will define not just this presidency, but the presidency itself for decades to come. That's a heavy burden, but it's also a sacred responsibility. The institutions we inherit aren't ours to break, you see. They're ours to protect and pass on. And if we fail that duty, well, the cost won't just be political, it'll be generational. So pay attention, stay informed, and remember, in any system, silence is a choice, you see, and sometimes the most expensive choice of all. Thank you for your time.